All right, our panel discussion. Here's how this is going to go. I'm going to lay down some groundworks and say a couple things before we get started. The first thing I want to say is thank you from everybody here and everybody in the freaking universe to you guys. Okay? Because the real absolute truth of this is if they did not have the time, tenacity, talent, I don't know, can I do all T's on this? To do what they do, to have the courage to get up here and share with us and to spend all their money and all their time researching this phenomenon and then telling us about it, we would not be as far along in our understanding of the universe as we are. So thank you guys all very much for everything that you do. Okay, now this has to be a kind of a controlled explosion up here, so you're going to have to bear with the rules. If you have questions, we need you to come and line up over on this side like we've been doing. We need you to stand on the X, hold the mic close to your mouth like this, because they're... Is that better? God. See, when I do this, it's too loud. All right. So do that, or I'm going to be underneath pushing the microphone up, okay? This is the time for you to ask the speakers questions. This is not the time for telling us your life story, okay? Now, not that we don't love hearing that. It's very important, but that's not what this is for. So if you need to set up your question, make it very, very brief, and then ask a very concise question. Try not to ask them yes or no questions. That's pretty boring, okay? But ask your question, and then for you guys, try and make your answers as concise as you can. There's a lot of you, and there's a lot of questions, and if we don't do that, then there's a lot of information that people won't get to hear or won't get to ask. So there's one mic up there. You know the reason. You guys have all been on panels before, so you know. There's one mic that forces only one of you to talk at a time, okay? So if you're asking a question, direct it at one of the researchers or all of them. It's but try and make that specific. Travis, please tell us blah blah. Or this is for the whole panel, and then they can all kind of fight it out and see who grabs the mic first and talks. Okay, everybody good with that? All right, I'm going over here. So this is going to be a really short panel discussion if people don't come up here and ask any questions. Oh, one of the things that we want to do first, actually, while everybody's kind of filing down here, one of the things we want you to do is just pass the mic down and do a minute or two about your feelings about this conference, experiences you've had here, or in general, your favorite memory about the conference, something like this. This is the 30th year. Just kind of honor us with your thoughts about the experience here.
I think, like I sort of alluded to in my talk, is that conferences like this are very important to the process of accustoming the public at large, the world in general, to the reality of this phenomenon. And it's kind of a two-pronged thing. The talks themselves are very informative, but just as important is the intercommunication that happens between the participants and the researchers. Aside from the talks, there's a tremendous amount of benefit that comes out of that kind of association. And this particular conference makes room for that in ways that has been very helpful to the overall mission.
I was thrilled to be invited to come here. This place has special memories for me, and I told you that when I did my talk. And it also, I really needed it. I don't go out and talk in public very much. And where I live, I don't talk about this stuff a lot. I don't have a lot of people to talk about it with. Thank God for the internet. But when I come, especially to this place, you don't know what you do for me. I try to give to you and share with you things inside of me as I change and grow and metamorphosize through this process, if that's the right word. I'm not good with words, but and I want to share that with other people like me. I was blessed to have support from family and friends and neighbors, and most people in my position are not. So I feel I want to pay it forward too, as I go along in this journey. And this weekend has re-energized me, helped me to refocus on my goals and what I want to do. And I wanted to thank you for that, because you gave that to me, and I am grateful. And hopefully I can come back sometime in the near future.
Love you. Well, I thought, wow, this is like the first year, because it's like a cycle. I got here and did not know if a particular whistleblower, also military background, a month ago was contacted and said, if I can, I'm going to bring something to talk with you about at Eureka Springs. So on Friday, there's some of us, we were up till 2:30. I think I got back to the room between 2 and 2:30. And that's the way it was in the old days. And I see on my iPhone on a table a text message from this military guy. I'm here. Well, it's 2:30 in the morning. So I sent a message and said, can you meet me at 9 a.m.? I'll take a nap. And that's what happened. And all day Saturday, I learned astounding material, which I hope in the next few months I am going to be able to report about. That is exactly the way Eureka Springs started. And this is another year of up till 2 o'clock and getting back up to talk with somebody about new information. I love it. Thank you.
This is my first time here, and this all feels really new to me still, doing this kind of thing. I had these experiences. For folks who saw my talk, the work I've been doing has been, in a way, my own therapy. And there was a chapter where it was pretty shaky, and I feel very happy and grounded to be here in this place right now. And it seems a little daunting to be sitting on the stage right now with these people who to call myself a peer, it seems a little daunting to say that, but it's been an amazing journey of the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I cornered you at a conference, and I was one of those people who needed to get my story out and needed to tell it. And over the last 10 years, it was about 10 years ago when this first started to unfold for me, I have been as dedicated as I can to be as honest as I can about what's happened to me, and it has been extremely challenging, and it feels like the act of talking about it publicly like this has been extremely helpful for me, so I'm just grateful to be here. I was very intimidated when I peeked in the room here. I did not know how big of a conference this was. I came in on Friday, looked in the room, I was like, oh, this is a big conference room. So I just want to say I'm very grateful to have this chance to I feel like start a new chapter of my life. This old chapter of my life when I was confused and mixed up, which I still am in many ways, but about the source of it. But as far as where I am in my heart, I feel like I'm at a much better place now. Thanks.
As I mentioned in my talk, if it hadn't been for Eureka Springs, I may not have been on the circuit. This is the first place I ever got invited to lecture many years ago, and it's sort of been something that got me started and helped me along, and I appreciate Lou Farish for what he did for me and brought me in a couple of years. I always say this is one of the best conferences there is, and to prove it, I actually brought a whole truckload of people from Canada and from LA. And at the end, after the 20-hour drive, they were sort of looking at me like I was trying to kill them, like they couldn't believe how long it took to get here. But it's a beautiful town. It is one of the best conferences, and I'm sure the people on this stage who have been around and done all the conferences will tell you this is one of the best conferences in the United States. This time I sort of added, I told them, you got to go downtown, you got to see this town and stuff. And they went yesterday, the people that were with me, and I added one thing this time. I actually went to the Crescent Hotel last night. We were sitting up on the fourth floor in the drinking area there having a beer, and we're waiting for the woman to jump off, and she didn't jump off, so that was my only disappointment.
I have to say that I was thrilled to be invited back. This is the third time that I've had the opportunity to speak at this conference, and I absolutely love it. It might be my favorite, at least it's in the top 2 of the conferences that I really, really enjoy speaking at, because it has a small town feel to me. Everybody is so friendly and open and approachable, and I really enjoy that part of it. And it's so well run as well. I love the kind of the campus feel, everything about it. I just absolutely love. And at this conference, I had the opportunity to speak with some Dolores Cannon-trained hypnotherapists in quantum healing. And as the director of MUFON's experiencer research team, I am always attempting to recruit therapists who are interested in working with experiencers that we would refer to them. And I have been very impressed by the hypnotherapists who were trained by Dolores Cannon. They've had a very high rate of success in helping experiencers to overcome the trauma, the fear that they might have had, and to really gain insight into what is occurring. So it was such a thrill for me to be able to sit down and talk to some of these therapists and even to be hypnotized by one of them. Thank you so much.
Well, it's my first time here. I hope it's not my last time, because I very much enjoyed it. And I don't often see as much conviviality, for want of a better word, as I have found here. The friendliness of the people, is the small town attitude, as somebody said. It's a pleasure. I wish it was a little easier to get to from where I live, but 3 plane flights and a long drive. But I hope I come back again. And it says something for the state of ufology that there's such a positive attitude about this place, and we're not spending all our time talking how terrible it is that the world doesn't accept ufology and stuff, because it does, and the people here accept it. That there's something important going on, and it's nice to be a part of it, and I'll look forward to being back next year to be a part of it.
The speakers up here at the table, we attend many conferences, but I'll never forget, as I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, coming down here with Forrest in 91, 92 to see the likes of Linda Howe and many other speakers and hear their presentations. And I was a conference attendee, and I never thought, if you were to tell me then, 17 years later, I'd be up here looking at you down there and talking about research that I'd been putting together, I would never believe it. And the one thing I always encourage conference attendees, we can't do it alone. And we really need your help. So I encourage you to become actively involved if you're not already. I know we have a lot of MUFON members out in the audience, but we can collaborate, we can work together, and we all need help. We can't do it alone. But the conference also has a personal touch. I know Linda will agree with this, with Lou. I mean, over the years working with Lou was an avid historian, an avid reader, and he used to call and email me and share news clippings. And then ultimately when he passed on, I acquired his collection. And I don't only think of this conference when I'm here. Every day I'm going through my files, I'll find a handwritten note from Lou or something like that. And I can't think of Eureka Springs, I can't think of the Ozark Mountain Conference without thinking of Lou. It's inextricably bound together. And so my history of growing up as a UFO researcher from my early 20s till now has always been tied to Eureka Springs. And like I said, it goes back to that first trip in 91, 92. And here we are 17 years later. We have a lot of data, we have a lot of information, but we're still trying to capture those elusive answers. And I'm just proud to be up here with my peers. I actually introduced Stan in October at a conference in Albuquerque, and I said, I remember being 10 years old watching late night television, watching UFOs are real. And I remember seeing this man thinking, wow, that must be really neat to grow up and be able to investigate UFOs full time. And now here I am sitting next to him. So it's very surreal when you really look at the big picture. But I'm just happy to be here, and I want to thank all of you for supporting us in our research.
Well, I have to also echo a great deal of gratitude to all of you, the staff, everybody who put this thing together. I'm thinking that there's two sides to this. Part of it is the heart and part of it is the mind. As far as an investigative effort, all of you are joined together in this, and I've never felt this particular conference, not just this Ozark conference, but this 30th conference has been so special to me. There's been so much synchronicity, I hardly even know where to start. But I guess I'd have to flash back in time and remember about 10 days after I had my first date with my wife, and we're now almost married 20 years, Linda autographed a book up in Bellevue, Washington for me, and she didn't know it, but then I was a policeman going through a difficult time in my life. I had only just met Joanne, and having her write kind words in a book meant everything to me. So I'm saying thank you, but I'm also saying all of you have an opportunity to encourage each other. And obviously you all already know that because there's been so much encouragement here, so much positive energy. And all I'm going to close with is just say thank you very much and keep helping each other. It's so important that you say something encouraging or that you listen to somebody who has a story to tell. I've also heard from people at this conference here, people who are in a bit of pain over past experiences. And we need to be there for each other. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. First question. Yes, you are.
Okay, first I have a question for Grant Cameron on what happened with the lady that had the interview last night, the wife of somebody that I forgot to write her name down. And the next is for basically everybody. First of all, I want to thank the organizers that they put together not only nuts and bolts people, but people kind of from the psychological, emotional areas, the scientific. We've got a broad spectrum here. And that's kind of what I want to ask is that I read John Mack's book, think he did a wonderful job. And I'm trying to blend together the holographic ideas of Talbot, the nuts and bolts of the people that have been abducted, the other people that have kind of gone into more of the what do you call it? Consciousness, subconsciousness, whatever it is. And I'm trying to come up with some kind of an assimilation. I asked this of Dr. Friedman. He said, oh, that's kind of beyond mine. I just wanted an opinion. But at any rate, if somebody could give their opinion, how they look at other people's happenings, experience, how that changes them or not, or solidifies, that's kind of what I'd like to know. Thank you.
Okay, as to what happened last night, you need some background. Because I do the President's UFO website, when Donald Trump was elected, I was contacted by some high-level financiers for Donald Trump. They believed he wasn't going to get a proper briefing, and they wanted me to give them material to put through his chief of staff to get a proper briefing. And I said, well, I don't know where the bodies are. I know nothing. I mean, I can't help you. And that's how it started. And then the other thing I work on is also the amount of stuff that's been leaked into the UFO community by the Central Intelligence Agency, and I've written about this in my latest book. And so this relates to what happened last night, is that there are 2 CIA people who seem to be in charge. There seem to be about 6 disclosure initiatives going on where they're gradually leaking material. And 2 of them involve one guy, his name is Jim Semivan, who was a briefer for the President of the United States, retired in 2008. He's running the Tom DeLonge operation, and he's also running an operation to get the story for Chris Bledsoe out into Hollywood. There's that initiative, and then there's the other one that's run by a guy that I've been chasing, I think Stan has had contact with, Dr. Ronald Pandolfi, who was identified by the New York Times as the top scientist in the CIA, who's run the CIA Weird Desk for UFOs since 1983. And he is almost blatantly putting stuff out now through his wife, whose name is Aliha Pandolfi. And she's running a YouTube channel, and you can go to her channel, and she's posted all sorts of interviews with Dan Smith. And what they do is they put this material through people who aren't totally credible, so that when you hear Dan Smith is telling the story, or John Lee, or whoever it is, you say, oh, it's just this person telling the story, don't worry about it. And this is how they're leaking the material. And last night they had an interview, and this is an interview that was done with Dan Smith and a producer from Hollywood. And Linda was in the room with me, or we were watching this, and it was just like a total mess of what they were doing. The key is, as I say, don't watch the puppet, who is Dan Smith, talking. The fact is that the head scientist for CIA, or whoever he is, that's run the UFO stuff, and I was told had briefed President Trump, along with a guy by the name of Mike Pillsbury and Jim Wosley, had done the briefing for Donald Trump on UFOs. It's his wife who's running this stuff, and they are very open. This is out there. You can watch her YouTube channel, and they are putting stuff out, and it basically has to do with a portal, which I thought was total nonsense. And they've actually got me convinced there may actually be some sort of portal in the United States. And they actually asked for volunteers last night to go through. So Katrina, who was with me, we said, yeah, we'll go. You know, like, I'll play the game. I don't know what's going to happen, but let me guarantee you, they are leaking stuff big time. I've never seen anything like it in 42 years.
Grant, let me just, and here are these guys, this Pandolfi, who has supposedly been head of SciTech at the CIA since 1983, and what was the consensus of what they communicated, even though it was in chaos? One of the sentences that I will never forget: UFOs are not ETs, they're UTs. And what they were talking about was that they are trying to get across the idea they're coming from another dimension. So now this seems to be one of the political steps that the government, at least through them, is taking. Other dimensions beyond not necessarily this matter universe, but from another dimension. And wouldn't you agree that was the bottom line?
Yeah, that's the other thing that they're, and the other thing is Tom DeLonge is getting this as well, that he's putting out the evil alien thing, which I really agree with. They're going to use nuclear weapons to kill aliens and stuff. But he's also putting out the consciousness thing, that the number one thing he was told by Lockheed Skunk Works is consciousness, and that's all the head scientists at Lockheed Skunk Works want to talk about. So you have this portal and this consciousness and this interdimensional thing. They call it the wishing well, that when you get on the other side of the portal, you enter this other dimension thing. So I think they're going to kick it down the road. It's not that they're going to make some big announcement. They want us to know that this is sort of a fact. And so they surround it by this disinformation where it gets out, but nobody really believes it, except for a few people like Linda and I who know what's going on.
My question is for anybody on the panel who it may pertain to. Have any of you, I just wondered if any of you had any thoughts or opinions or have done any research on the UFO crash that occurred in Cape Girardeau, Missouri in 1941, which preceded Roswell by nearly 6 years.
Well, I can say that I talked to Charlotte Mann, and it was her grandfather who was called in to do the last rites, I guess I would say, for an alien. And I found other people who could back up her story, who'd heard the same story early on and stuff. And of course, I still have the question, so what did they do with this at that time? I mean, we were starting a war, a big war, a major war. I think they had other things on their mind, that they weren't going to worry about how this thing worked. They had to worry about staving off the enemies of the country, of the world. But I was very favorably impressed by Charlotte and the other people I talked to. So I'm certain it happened. What went wrong, I have no idea in terms of, why did the thing crash and stuff. But it's a good case. And Charlotte's still around, last I heard anyway. And so maybe we'll find out more about that. Maybe some people will crawl out of the back room and enlighten us.
I just have one thing to add to that. I went to Ohio a number of years ago to interview two sisters who were in their 80s. And there's an interview on the internet. Mine is not on the internet. I did a 13-minute interview with them, and they absolutely are totally convincing that in 1948, their father, who was a minister, a Pentecostal, a Presbyterian minister in Ohio, told them that he had been taken by Cordell Hull to the sub-basement of the Capitol, in exactly the same room where Jesse Marcel said that he was told that Roswell was real, in the sub-basement, and they, this was under Cordell Hull, and that they were shown, he was shown bodies in jars and a sort of a crash-type object in the room. And the thing is that Cordell Hull resigned as Secretary of State in 1944, so whatever they saw happen before 1944, it didn't have to do with Roswell.
And for those of you who have heard my Coast and Dreamland and Earth Files, the reports that I have done the last year with Paul Blake Smith on his work for what he calls Mo 41, the first Roswell. And the date that seems to be a growing consensus is that it was April 12th, 1941. And one of the interesting facts is that FDR was a 33rd degree Mason. Cordell Hull was the 33rd degree Mason. He was Secretary of State. The Secretary of War was George Marshall. And the story that Paul Blake Smith tells in the book, based both on some of the testimony of those sisters that were related to Cordell Hull, is that the White House gets this communication from Sikeston in Missouri, which was south of Cape Girardeau. And this was a military unit that gets called out to go to this scene, and that the craft is not round, it is a wedge-shaped craft that 6 years later in Roswell, New Mexico, the three that came down between July 2nd and July 5th were wedge-shaped, they were not round. And that this was a very interesting detail, that the people at the scene, he's talked with some that knew one of the men that had the camera taking photographs. And on the ground were three bodies that at the scene, it was very clear they looked absolutely identical. And so the concept of clones came into the Cape Girardeau case. But the decision about what do they do, they've got something that they considered was from outer space, they've got three clones. And Paul Blake Smith adds this perspective that at that time, being a 33rd degree Mason, and all of these people in the government that were in authority were 33rd degree Masons, that the Capitol was built with 33rd degree Mason architecture principles with 1, 2, 3, that's the question, sub-basements. And the decision was there was no Area 51 then, there was no Pentagon. The only large building in Washington, D.C. that they all thought was the safest place in the United States was the nation's capital. And the story that Paul Blake Smith has been able to stitch together is a decision was made for that Sikeston unit to get those three clone bodies and that wedge-shaped craft to Washington, D.C., and that they may still be in a sub-basement of the nation's capital.
Hello, my name is Adrian. This is for the entire panel. Just to quickly begin, I as a human being do not feel that I have the ability to appropriately illustrate the service to our species that you have provided and that you continue to provide, and the thanks that could possibly be appropriately endowed to each and every one of you, and to those whom haven't come forward, and to those who will come forward in the future. I study history, I study sociology, and time throughout, it is those whom have the courage directly measured by the disproportion of those unwilling to believe that are those who perform true feats of wonderful humanity. And so I, as a human being whom have not been informed otherwise up to this point previously, thank you with every single capacity that I have. And so in that effort, I ask you, what do you think, in your most objective opinions, would be the best way for us as a community to bring this forward and further into the immediacy of the rest of the human species? Because really that's how people make their decisions, and that's how people choose to coordinate their value system and their decisions that follow as a result of that, and to be able to align their resources and their influences to be able to achieve the goals that they have. What can we do as a people to be able to make that more immediate for everyone else, so that everyone else can have the experience that I have had, in order to be able to push our knowledge forward and become more objective as a species? Sorry. I apologize if that was a super crazy question, but
So a couple things. Individuals could, if people have had these experiences, it is a big, bold thing, and I understand perfectly well if folks choose not to share their stories, their personal experiences in a public forum. But I would say do it at the dinner table, do it at the campfire, carefully do it. You'll know right away if people want to hear it or not. You'll know within the first 2 seconds when you say, I had this really weird thing happen. And I would say for the individuals who've experienced this thing, and I'm talking about whether it's a sighting, whether it's an abduction, there are more people having these experiences than are known publicly. The little joke I made is if you want to know if this is true, if you want proof of this being true, look at my email inbox. That's the proof. That's the proof for me. So I would say just share this stuff. You can share it cautiously. You don't have to overwhelm anyone. But just if you're an individual, share this stuff. And my sense is and certainly in the last 20 years, things have changed enormously. I have come forward with my experiences. I've had almost no backlash. I sense a little bit, but my family has been remarkably supportive. Other people I know, if they're not outright supportive, they are not dismissive. So yes, things are changing, and it has to happen from the bottom up. And to try to lobby from the top down, I think, is important. But the bottom up has to happen at the same time.
I'll just make my little quick speech I always make. This is all individual. I say that I don't really try to convince anybody, and I always remind people it's not just the people on this panel, it's the people in this room, that you are in the Super Bowl of all stories. You could have been born an untouchable in the streets of Calcutta and spend your time in the junkyard looking for something valuable enough to sell for food for tomorrow. You did not get that role. You got to be in this, the most amazing story of all times. And you were born, you were going to die, you agreed to do something in this life, and so to me it's an individual thing. What am I supposed to do? I'm in this game, what's my role? You may be the water boy, you may be the quarterback, whatever it is, you're in the Super Bowl of all stories, and you should appreciate the fact that you're here.
The approach that I take when I'm just conversing with people at the gym or in town or anywhere and they don't really know what I do, is I will recommend to them that they look at the documents that are readily available. I might say, did you know in September of 1947 that the Air Materiel Command determined that flying discs are real, that they're circular, they can outfly and outmaneuver any of our craft, and I can tell them where to look for that document online and in the Condon Report, in case they wonder if that document really is false. It wouldn't be in the Condon Report if it were a false document. So I like to take that kind of approach instead of telling personal stories, because a personal story is something that they could say, she's just a nut. But if you point them in the direction of the government evidence, I think it's a good approach.
I think one thing we could all do that would help our search for truth is to correct, whenever we have a chance, the false impressions given by people who think most people don't believe in flying saucers. Everybody thinks this is nutty. Phil Klass once said, believers to non-believers, 3 to 11. That's nonsense. The polls show there are more believers than non-believers. But as long as people think most people don't think favorably about this, they'll keep their mouths shut, many of them. And that's unfortunate. We need more discussion, more classes, with a C. Sorry. I think we have a duty when we see an error to correct it, not to let phony notions get by. So I think that's a responsibility on everybody. Listen to what people are saying. If they're saying things that aren't true, correct them. It's okay to believe in flying saucers. The greater the education, the more likely to believe in flying saucers. The polls show this. It's not me. So that's something we can all do, is to enrich the area around us, so to speak, by correcting the false information.
I think the short answer to the question, which I would pose, is that for every person here, if you plan on coming back next year, find one person that's open-minded, that's educated, that's willing to listen to the information. Just think if everyone, just double this audience right now, and imagine that next year. And I would also recommend, trying to, and I know it's difficult, especially for people in certain positions, government positions, et cetera, to lose the timidity. Don't be shy about your interest in UFOs. And I've certainly seen things change as far as the society over the last 25 to 30 years. People are more open to it. You're seeing a lot more on television. And I've done school lectures, I've done adult lectures, UFO conferences. Some of the most interesting are like the Rotary clubs and groups like that. They don't necessarily have a vested interest in UFOs. They have a speaker talking about everything from animal husbandry to UFOs to, origami. But it's interesting when you get those audiences, because quite often they haven't been exposed to anything with regard to the UFO subject. But no surprise, like many people, they're not educated on the subject, but they have an opinion. And I've had people come up, I've had the mayors of towns come up, bank presidents come up after that and saying, I never gave UFOs a second thought, but the material you presented today has really got me thinking. And I think if we can do that, and all of us can do that, and I don't mean just the people up here on the stage, if all of us can engage in an articulate, educated discussion on the subject, and admittedly, there's going to be people that just are simply not going to be open-minded. I mean, it's going to fall on deaf ears. But, there are people out there, there is an interest. But I think, as someone mentioned, you have to broach the subject first. And as soon as you bring up UFOs, and James alluded to this in his presentation yesterday, I guarantee, I think is what you said, you're going to have 2 or 3 people that are going to say, you know what I saw, you know what my sister saw, let me tell you about my mother and father back in 1965. And so broach the subject. Don't be ashamed, and be proud of your interest in the subject. And none of us would be up here if we were timid or shy by any means. So, lose the timidity, and I hate to use the term, come out of the closet. Don't be ashamed of your UFO interest. And that's what I would recommend.
I could barely add much to that, except to say that when you meet other people and they think about something that you've spoken to them about, they not only remember what you say, they remember mostly how you made them feel. That's extremely important. So they need to come away from that brief conversation, or lengthy one, with a feeling that they are on the trail of something better, that they feel a little happier about being in the universe. If you can turn it to a positive statement, that's what I would advocate. Stay away from, there's so much negativity and gloom out there right now. If you can put a positive note in it, Maybe this is a bigger and broader universe than anybody thought. There are more possibilities than ever. Maybe it isn't mankind's last hour. Maybe it's mankind's best hour. Somehow turn it around and keep it positive. It's the positive that's going to win, not the negative.
I'd just like to add in terms of science, there was a bit of a unexpected revolution in September. How many people know John Brandenburg or have read John Brandenburg's Death on Mars? John was invited to do a presentation at the prestigious NASA science conference in California in September. And his subject is the explosion of 2 hydrogen bombs above Cydonia on Mars. And the hypothesis is that at least 1 million years ago, based on data from Viking, the Viking in 76, is that John, who got his PhD from the University of California in Berkeley in nuclear physics, became very interested in questions about what would the xenon-129 level be in Mars around Cydonia, because somebody had said to him in a library at Berkeley, one of the senior physicists, yeah, we know there was nuclear war on Mars. So that was something that had been told to John in the context of a classified room in a classified building with classified people, and that senior physicist maybe shouldn't have said that to John Brandenburg, but it set him on his own passionate path. And in September, part of his presentation was a graph in this statement, that the amount of xenon-129 that they have confirmed, and he's showing these graphs, on Mars is 2.5 times the level that was measured in this planet after 1945. And the reason there is that timeline demarcation, it was July and August. We had White Sands, and then we had Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And for him, 2.5 times xenon-129 on Mars as a data point, but now in conjunction with what I understand is a confirmation that they do have trinitite identified in the Cydonia region and going a few miles outside of it. Trinitite, and Stan, you could tell me, I believe it's a fair statement to say that the melting of silicon sand to that greenish kind of structure, it exists only on a few places on this planet, one at the Trinity site at White Sands, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Western Egypt, an area that slops over between India and Pakistan, and the Sahara Desert. And now we have researchers that are saying that the Anunnaki, Enlil and Enki, fought each other with nuclear weapons. So how big and what is the scope of interactions going back millions of years between intelligences in at least this Milky Way galaxy that have fought each other, and that we may be the residue of genetic manipulation by those that fought with nuclear weapons? And this is not to be down this morning. This is to say we've all got to face reality, and that John Brandenburg was invited by NASA to do that presentation. And I talked with him 2 weeks after. I said, have you been slammed? He says, I have not had anybody slam me. And he said, remember, my search started by a senior physicist in a classified library who said to me, we know that there was nuclear war on Mars.
Well, some of those responses were a good setup, I think, to my question. I noticed one of the recurring themes is skeptics. in the talks, and some in particular got pretty strong reactions. I was wondering, usually they're, a thorn in the side and at best diluted, maybe at worst manipulated, threatened. Is there a reasonable position of skepticism for those who haven't had that kind of firsthand experience? I think we've kind of alluded to the fact that the UFOs could land outside in the parking lot or on the White House lawn daily, and there's nothing we could do about it. But for whatever reason, they've chosen not to. Is there a reasonable position for those who haven't accepted, the evidence as presented? And is there a reasonable role for skeptics? Have they ever proven helpful in maybe guarding our own arguments? I was curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, in my opinion, a skeptic should not necessarily be a dirty word. I think there's a place for healthy skepticism in any area of inquiry, whether it be UFOs, science in general, health, politics, you name it. It comes down to two things. You test things in a way, whatever's being presented needs to be testable. Are the facts true, and is the reasoning valid? The entire argument comes down to those two things. And there are rules in the conduct of inquiry, guidelines that if you follow them, you get good results, and if you don't, you get garbage. And everyone needs to be aware of that. It actually should be a part of our educational system. Skeptic shouldn't be a dirty word. Debunker is, because it's someone who sets out with a conclusion and sets out to discredit an idea more in a propaganda sense than any sort of objective evaluation.
Philip Glass being the best example.
Pass it down to Stan.
Stan's the expert on skeptics.
Well, there's nothing wrong with being skeptical. We all should be skeptical. That is, you have to say, I don't know when you start your search for truth, whether it's about a UFO sighting or a whole bunch of other things. The problem comes, the skeptic has to say, I don't know. The debunker says, I do know. There can't possibly be. And so we ignore all the evidence. I was very pleased. I was asked by a Canadian journalist to speak to an annual meeting of Canadian journalists 60 miles from where I live, so sure, why not? I did, and he told me later, he said, I've never seen so many journalists change their minds so quickly. They just hadn't been aware of how much evidence there is. So there's nothing wrong with their being skeptical. They had no reason not to be until I put a bunch of data, facts, et cetera, in front of them. So that's the thing, that you want to make sure you get the facts out there and don't deal with the debunkers unless you have to proclaim their idiocy. I mean, they give you plenty of excuses to do that. People, I've had some eyebrows raised when I said I've debated Seth Shostak, Michael Shermer, and I don't think they'd either debate me again. But you should be encouraged by the fact that in Shermer's case, I got 80% of the vote of the audience. This is on Coast to Coast Radio. He got 20%. That says he didn't know what he was talking about. At least with Shostak, it was 57, 33, 10. But what I'm saying is you can win a debate when you have facts and the other person doesn't. And it's very commonly the case when people are talking about UFOs, if you got a noisy negativist there, that he doesn't have the facts. Research by proclamation. And the easy way to handle that is to present data. So you have to tell the truth, and you have to have the evidence. But the debate is winnable easily.
Just to back up what Stan said, educated skepticism Know what you're talking about before you open your mouth. A case that I investigated in Illinois was covered on a documentary, and inevitably, we had Michael Shermer and all these other people on there disparaging these witnesses, calling into question their psychological makeup, et cetera. They never went to Illinois to meet these men, yet they're psychoanalyzing them. They didn't have degrees in psychology, by the way, but they're psychoanalyzing these people at a distance. I mean, it's worse than a radio psychologist. But they're disparaging these people. They're questioning their testimony. They never went on location with the witnesses. I did. To Stan's point, do the investigation, do the research before you start opening your mouth and passing judgment. And, I referenced skepticism and skeptics in my presentation, and we talked about it last night at the dinner. When I reference skeptic, I mean that with a capital S. People that identify themselves as the ever-present devil's advocate. Stan says white, I say black. It doesn't matter. They just want to take a contrary position. And that really adds nothing to the discussion. And any field of scientific inquiry, to Travis's point, should have skepticism. There has been a litany of con artists, hoaxers, liars in this field. Again, like Linda said, not to put it on a negative note, but we have to be wary of those minefields. We tread very lightly through this field because people are making claims that oftentimes aren't true. And we certainly don't want to hang our hats on that. We don't want to have egg on our face, and sometimes we may get caught accidentally, but we have the tenacity to push forward and admit, okay, we found out that person's credentials aren't what they appeared to be on the surface, or their claims didn't meet the burden of proof. But we need to be skeptical. I know James is skeptical as a former police officer. He's trained to be that way. But we have to be very, very careful, and all I can say is if you're going to make statements or pass judgment on witnesses or on cases, and to Stan's point, they often make generalizations. Well, humans are poor observers. Well, that doesn't mean that they hallucinated. It doesn't mean that there wasn't an object there. It just means it may have been 20 feet, not 100 feet in size, but nevertheless, the object was in fact there. So I don't know if James would like to add anything.
I would like everybody to become acquainted with a person next to them. I talked about this person in my presentation. The rational man or woman. This person should be with you at all times, and you're constantly asking them, what would a rational person conclude if they were confronted with the evidence that's being presented to me right now? Now, that's not to say that I know everything. It's not to say that I'm not going to change my position at some future point when more evidence comes in, but I'm constantly evaluating where I am right now. Has it met some kind of burden of proof? Will it convince other people? Will it convince a group of scientists or engineers or, any particular group that you might want to approach? So I do believe in healthy skepticism. Keep your wits about you. My favorite prosecutor, when he would charge the jury, would always lean back and he'd say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, don't leave your common sense at the door.
Before we go to the next question, I want to add a little bit to this topic, because I hope that all of you leave here today and go out and kind of spread the word. As crazy as that sounds, you're going to do it automatically, but seriously is one of the biggest benefits that can come out of a conference like this, is that you go and tell other people the crazy stuff that you learned while you were here. And then they're going to tell, and they're going to tell, and this ripple effect goes out. And so don't ever think for a minute that however small or large a conference is, that it doesn't have an effect on the world, because it absolutely does. Not because of what we say here, but because of what you say when you leave. So when it comes to this skeptical subject, remember this. There's another dynamic to this that is very sinister, kind of. Pursuing the truth takes a lot of courage. Okay, especially if you're interested in this, or if you're a researcher, we've all gone through this, where you go out there and you see the UFO. Okay, well, it might scare the bejesus out of you. Okay, maybe it doesn't. Maybe you go, oh, that's fascinating. But it changes, it rewires your brain. Okay. Well, that's hard to do. And it's very, very scary for a lot of people. So skepticism can be used as a form of denial. okay, almost like a doctrine or following a particular religious belief because it's easy. You don't have to think and you don't have to make decisions anymore. And I had an experience about this with an engineer I used to work with in St. Louis. And when he found out I was into UFOs, he was just like all over me, okay? This was back in the early 90s. And so I would debate with him more for fun because I wasn't getting anywhere. But I found out that he was a subscriber to the Skeptical Inquirer, the horrible, rag that is the negative thing that we all talk about. And what I realized is that he didn't look for the truth. He just read what the Skeptical Inquirer said, and that became his belief system. Okay, so he was a skeptic, but reading this crazy skeptical Bible. Okay. But when presented with real information, he was afraid to examine it. Now, this guy was an intelligent chemical engineer. So keep this in mind. Some people are skeptics that way because they're afraid to learn the truth. Okay? If you have to, sometimes you might have to break through that barrier by not being threatening, but like, well, what about this? And you let them think about the questions you ask. They'll come to the conclusions themselves, but you can't change their decision to stay in denial if they want to. So.
I agree, and fear is behind so much of the resistance in a surprising way. Occasionally, I'll get somebody who really blasts me online, and, just call me everything, and then a lot of hostility. But I respond with, don't be afraid. This isn't going to happen to you. And it's amazing how often that actually works. It turns them around. They're apologizing and all this, where the real motivation was just fear, that once I tell them it's not going to happen to you, they're not coming for you, at that point, then it's so much easier to believe. But, yes, skepticism. You ask, how do you know this? And by that, you mean where can you point me to the source of information where when I examine it for myself, I'll be as certain of this as you are?
Well, I appreciate the courage because we all know that the great George Adamski was murdered for doing exactly what you are doing when he was exposing the UFOs, and the fact that when he met with the ETs that they were wearing the patch of the OWASP sign, the Faith's UFO Bible. But I think it's wonderful, and I hope Cameron will organize, if he hasn't already, a listening group and contact Ivanka Trump, and so I can all see your picture with Trump on Twitter. I'm really enjoying that. Now, in the spirit of this being Easter, I want to, remind us that many of us believe that the Star of Bethlehem was a UFO, and that the storms that happened the day that Jesus was crucified was to cover up the UFO that came back to get his spirit. And so, there's all these things going on, and I'm thinking about the MIB, Men in Black movie, and the shocking thing at the end, and we've all talked about that here today, about memory loss when you're abducted, and the fact that when he finished his career as the agent, they just wiped his memory. And I didn't know, on the YouTube channel that I work with, Chris the Wizard, he's talking about all of us having our memories wiped who were born after 1997, and that we're all 200 years older than we think we are. And I wondered if anybody wanted to comment about the intergalactic war in 1996 that we had to lose our memories about. Yeah, do they want to comment about the war in 1996? And if not, does anyone want to comment about the merging timelines?
Well, the reason I'm not commenting is because I haven't heard about any of that.
Okay. Yeah, well, Chris the Wizard talks about everything that David and Corey talk about, but a little bit more, because he's channeling Michael and Valiant Thor, and the work that Valiant Thor continues to do today. So, well, thank you all for coming.
Next. Good. Stand on next, please.
Were any of you on the investigative team that researched the Stephenville, Texas sighting several years ago? And could you give us an update on anything that's transpiring there?
That was a series of events over a period of time, of which the highlight was a videotape that lasts 12 minutes that was taken from a porch with the man propping himself up like this with the door frame to make him solid, and videotaped a light that was pulsing, and it was pulsing in symbols. Some of the symbols are recognizable in some of the ancient Middle Eastern languages. And the other issues were that people ranging from state patrol to police officers were seeing things that were large, low over town, more of the pulsing lights that went on for quite a while. And I think back that maybe the most interesting piece of research came from studying radar, and there was a report put about this, that when they took all of the various eyewitness sightings and put them on a timeline, they had a vector, and the vector came over quite many miles, but went right to George Bush President's ranch. And no one knows or has put together why, but there was all of these events that seemed to be along an axis, and George Bush's ranch house was at the end of that. And because we don't have answers, makes it even more puzzling that over many days and many people, Stephenville, the most important thing, I think, was that 12-minute videotape, which became very controversial in the legal sense, that when I put frames directly from the video having been given a DVD to use by a businessman in town who paid money, he paid money to the guy who was standing on the porch. When I put those up at earthfiles.com with the idea that I was going to go through and match what I was finding in Middle Eastern symbols, I got first a call, and then I got a letter from an attorney in Los Angeles saying, cease and desist or we will sue you. Those words were in. This video is the property of a named producer in Los Angeles. And when I called the businessman in Stephenville and said, you gave me the DVD and said you had paid the man who stood on the wood, and he said, yes, I did. And then I sent him a copy that I'm being threatened by an attorney in a Beverly Hills address. Ultimately, in all that went down around that, I came to the conclusion, probably, that the Beverly Hills attorney was operating the way they do as a cushion shot for one of the alphabet soups. That the fact that I was going to go through all that work to go frame by frame by frame on that video and post it at Earth Files was just intolerable to them. And so I had to cease and desist. But for anybody who wants to really know what was at the heart of the Stephenville, January 2007, 8. It was January 2008. Go to Google and put in original Stephenville video of symbols and watch it yourself. It's quite fascinating. And know that some of those symbols actually match ancient languages.
I would just like to add, earlier we had the question about what can we do to move the thing along, and I'd just like to pay tribute to Angela Joyner, who was the one who broke the story. I knew her fairly well. I went and visited her for quite a while in Texas, and we had sort of a disagreement. She said, you know, one day what had happened was she was getting inundated for these phone calls with all these witnesses, and she had to do the front page story, she had to do the court story, and she had to do one other story in the newspaper. And because she was getting inundated with UFO stuff, she wasn't doing her work. And they had the biggest paper ever when this story broke. And then they said to her, Angela, it's over, leave it alone. You got work to do. And she said, well, what do I do with the people who keep phoning me? And they said, ignore them. And so eventually she ended up in the office. They heard her having a phone call with the Dallas Morning News, I think it was, and they figured she was back on the UFO story again, and so she was called into the office, and her computer and her Rolodex was in a box, and she said, well, no, they were going to fire me. And I said, Angela, in Canada, if you end up in an office and they've got your Rolodex and your computer, that's called getting fired. So I'd like to pay tribute to Angela Joyner. I said to her, as I said, this is the biggest story of all times. And I said, Angela, I mean, this ruined her life. Let me tell you, she never recovered. She never got a job really in newspapers again. She struggled for many years with no job. And so I said to her, and I say to everybody, whatever you do, 500 years from now, Angela, your great-great-great-great-grandchildren will say, that was my great-great-grandmother that did that, and I'm proud of her. And even though it cost her a lot of pain, she will go down in history as the person who stood up to the media and continued to cover the story.
And to Grant's point, some of you may have been here that year. This was one of the few venues that, again, underscoring the importance of these conferences, where Angela was here and presented her findings, unfortunately before she lost her job. But I had the opportunity, and many of us had the opportunity that have been longstanding attendees here, to actually meet her and hear her research. But yeah, it's a tragic story.
I would only add very briefly, if you want another side of it, and I think a really good side, and I may be getting myself into trouble with the higher-ups in MUFON by saying this, but look up the name Ken Cherry, who I believe was the state director of Texas at the time, and who was initially the primary MUFON investigator, the supervisor at the scene in Stevensville. And his account of the Stevensville events is an excellent piece of investigation. It doesn't have everything, but it will give you a really good, solid overview. And he's another one who unfortunately suffered in the aftermath of Stevensville.
My question is for Travis. Travis, I've been very impressed in the past that you're able to kind of step outside your experience a little bit and have a little empathy for the people you met. I was just wondering, like most pilots, I don't appreciate necessarily the little gifts that birds leave on the airplane. So I got an inflatable owl. And later on, a friend of mine told me, well, just cut out a couple of big circles, put pupils. And of course, it gives the airplane kind of a comical appearance, like it's wearing novelty store glasses or something. But the point of this is, every time I opened the hangar door, I would get this twinge. I would become very uncomfortable with those large staring eyes. And obviously, it's an inanimate object. It has no evil intent. And I was just wondering if you feel that in your state of mind, when you woke up, that there's something about, as primates, we've got this thing, or mammals, we've got this thing with the large binocular eyes that immediately makes us fearful and uncomfortable. And if that might not explain some of the nightmares you had and some of the negative experiences other people who have had contact have, they really didn't have a chance to fully communicate or understand what they were dealing with. They've had a wonderful experience with the octopus, but it's also the favorite subject of movie makers for terrible monsters. And obviously, octopi aren't terrible monsters. They can be beautiful creatures. So anyway, that's my question. Do you think maybe some of this is just, as human beings, we're wired to be fearful of things different than ourselves, and that accounts for a lot of this negativity?
Oh, well, certainly, the staring eye thing, insect camouflage very often involves what's called eye spots. They put eye spots on things to frighten away something that might consume it. They're realized just this tiny thing over here, but they simulate these gigantic eyes to, become a bigger creature as a means of defense. And, you know, the whole thing was staring. There's a convention amongst humans that when you're talking to somebody, it's disrespectful not to look at them at all, but it's also considered rude or actually a threat gesture if you stare too much. And occasionally I run into people who don't observe those conventions, and it can make you very uncomfortable. They don't have a clue that this is not proper body language etiquette to be staring so intently and unbrokenly. It's just not the way we do things. But the owl thing is a very common screen memory used in hypnotic regression. Very often people have a memory of an owl, and it turns out with further hypnotic unveiling to be the aliens themselves. And I've had personal experience with that sort of thing too. So, yeah. But again, I did relate the stare to the function of the telepathic projection, that they're, through these very large openings, somehow using that as a means of projecting this communication or control or whatever.
Real quick follow-up. Did you feel there was something benevolent about that, or in your state of mind, did you just not like it?
Well, I did not like it. It was extremely uncomfortable because it wasn't working. The things that they were trying to tap into, I think, had been jumbled because of the electrical discharge that had, temporarily at least, wounded that function. And so it was excruciating to feel their efforts because it wasn't working. And but I really don't think it was because they were projecting animosity or aggression or anything. It was just they were trying to reassure or control or subdue me, and things just weren't functioning properly at that point.
I don't know if you've ever mentioned this. Did you get any feeling that there was something fearful on their part when you kind of became violent?
Oh, definitely. I think
Okay.
the reason they left at that point is because their one trump card, their ability to control me telepathically, wasn't there at that point. You know, just being bigger than them, I was more of a threat than they were, even in a weakened state like that.
I know this isn't the most flattering comparison, but I can imagine a injured animal waking up at the vet and the assistants running around, hey, that thing just woke up and is trying to brain fill with a medical scanner, you know. And so you did feel that they were kind of fearful themselves and they wanted to control the situation, get someone in there to calm you down.
Yeah, for their good and my own.
Yeah, and they didn't try to harm you in any way because they were fearful.
Right.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
This is kind of going back to the Cape Girardeau crash. So obviously, I'd like to ask Linda and anybody else that might have input on this. And then this, but anyway, without going into family history, my great uncle, my grandpa, my paternal grandfather's brother was stationed at Fort Leonard Wood. And he had been visiting family in Arkansas and was hitchhiking back on May 15th of 1941. So that would have been, about a month after the crash. There was, including him, there was 4 people in the truck. And it was a single vehicle accident not far out of Van Buren, Missouri. And my Uncle Guy was killed. Now, we have actually found the newspaper story that talks about where it was and the date and everything. But my question is the possibility, and it kind of triggered something in me in your speech last year when you was talking about that, is that was there more sightings after that crash? I mean, could that have been one reason that this vehicle did crash and he died? And also, because of my personal history, my sister's, my dad's, even my grandfather's, I've seen things that we cannot explain. Is there, have you found a history, or if anybody else could answer this as well, of sightings or whatever, that they run in families?
The very next day, I believe, on April 13th, 1941, a man, I think, called one of the local newspapers, and they had a report of some kind of a UFO. So to answer the first part, I'm not saying that there's evidence of a flap, but there definitely was, there was something else in the sky that somebody else had reported. But if the April 12th, 1941 date is correct, it was at night, and the Reverend's, she was the niece, man, I've talked with her quite a bit about what she remembered seeing of this photograph that her father, the Reverend, had shown them at the table, and she had done sketches and all. So I guess what I'm saying is we don't need to have had a lot of other UFO phenomena. This stands by itself because of the evidence and testimony and the work that has been done around that period of time in April. Now, if I'm understanding the May, you are asking about May because you're tying it to something of a UFO nature?
Possibly. I mean, but yes, I mean, I was just wondering if there was more sightings in that area even afterward that could have possibly caused the driver to freak out and run off the road. Just because of where they were, the time frame, all of it happening together. And it's probably just a huge coincidence.
I don't know how we would know.
Well, that was what, I didn't know if there was more sightings, so that would be the...
Well, the bigger picture is Missouri in this area, there's tremendous amounts of limestone. And just like the UK, why for 2,000 years has the UK on this planet been, possibly because we have spoken English and it's our mother country, but you think of the UK as having a tremendous amount of phenomena. From the Black Panthers that are huge, they've even had photographs, to crop formations, to UFOs, to ETs, to all sorts of things. And some people have hypothesized if you take any large mass of limestone and you run water through it, that there is possibly some impact on magnetic fields, and that it might explain why there are certain areas of this planet with a lot of limestone that would have more phenomenon. And I think that Missouri long has had a history of many types of phenomena. But you can't say a place that does not have a limestone base with water running through it doesn't have phenomena either. And so we are always looking for reasons. Why does something happen more here than someplace else? And I would say that New Mexico is a good example of why. We're dealing with phenomena that appears to have some great concern about the planet itself. And that if the laboratory of Earth trumps their experimentation on Earth, which could be, as far as I'm concerned, extraterrestrial biological entities manipulated DNA in already evolving primates to create Homo sapien. I think that is a fact. And we are a model. And if we are being provoked by another intelligence through Einstein to come up with E equals MC squared that leads to the development of atomic bombs, and it's manipulated and there's conflict, the fission from everything that I understand, tears into other dimensions. And if we are like babies in the universe and we are given something as powerful as the tools to make atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs, then it makes me feel better to know that some intelligence out there put a stop to that. I believe that's true, and that all those interruptions in our Minuteman missiles, and I think at RAF Bentwaters and a lot of places, it gives me a feeling of hope that we may have been set in motion and we may be considered a bit dangerous, and that there are intelligences that are trying to keep a handle on what is happening on this planet. But if push came to shove, I really think the planet as a laboratory trumps the need for humans to continue to exist. I want us to exist. I want to see my fellow human beings be told the truth. I would love to be alive on this planet when we all knew that there is this other life, and some of it may not be good, but that something has cared enough to keep us going through the nuclear atomic age.
Well, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate all of your input. I think my question is going to be directed to Linda. You've spoken of the Anunnaki, and you just gave a wonderful rendition of what you think is going on the planet, and I totally agree with that. So if it's true that the Anunnaki 300,000 years ago did, this experimentation on us, and the Georgia Stones, I would believe, would be a part of the Anunnaki, and maybe you'd want to address that, I don't know. But it seems to be a rush of maybe taking some of us out. Fukushima is dumping 300,000 tons of radioactivity into the Pacific Ocean daily. We have our chemtrails. So I guess my question is, we have the Anunnaki, which my understanding is that they are reptilian. Do you see a benevolent race coming in and doing something with Fukushima? Because if something doesn't happen with Fukushima, we're kind of done for, I think.
I guess it was just a month ago, I got a note from somebody who has kept me up to speed a little bit on what's happening in Japan and Fukushima, and it is a horrible situation. Essentially, for those of you who do not know, I think it's Unit 1, it is still basically in a meltdown mode. They sent in 2 advanced robots, and both robots died, quote unquote, within minutes of trying to get to the core. So far, they have not been able to have anything last to take a look at what is continuing to put out a tremendous amount of radiation. And you're raising an interesting question about if there were non-humans who spent the time that they did in the 60s and the 70s interfering with the Minuteman missile range, would there be a threat that would provoke them to do something at Fukushima, or have they already done something? See, we have a blackout. For those of you who do not know, there was I've reported a lot about this at Earth Files. There was a professor teaching English in a city there who, on his own initiative, because he had children, got a good Geiger counter and went over to the elementary school near their house. This was about within that year or two after the 3/11 catastrophe. And the amount of radiation in the elementary school, on the swings, on the ground, on the cement, on the steps, on the windows, was way higher. And he started reporting, and I did interviews with him, and the next thing is the Japanese government literally passed a law that people cannot talk about radioactivity. They cannot share, there were reporters, there was a reporter jailed for doing an honest report with a Geiger counter and a report in a newspaper and got jailed. So essentially what we have is a 1984 bass-ackwards upside-down situation where what is the truth right now in Japan? Because the government essentially has made it illegal to do honest investigation. And the only person that I know, Arnie Gunderson, who does Fair Winds out of Vermont, he made a trip last year, and he took a Geiger counter. And what he was reporting was so dangerous. And we're facing a Japanese government that wants to have the Summer Olympics in Japan with not a single tourist being aware of the reality of what is happening in the radiation in Japan. They've literally outlawed discussion to make it go away. So I don't really know, outside of Arnie Gunderson's work a year ago, and he thought it was so dangerous that he was making reports at Fair Winds and worked with me. But here is an example of where authority and government and power, whether you're talking about the UFO situation or Fukushima, where governments will take a policy for self-serving interests that have absolutely nothing to do with the reality of the situation that could be threatening, especially to people going to the Olympics. And money is guiding everything. And so it's a really dangerous and weird question. Would non-humans step in to Fukushima as they did in the 60s and the 70s at the Minuteman missile site? I don't know.
The Georgia Stones, for those who may not be aware, there's a statement that the world population is to be maintained at 500 million, and we are over 7 million now, or 7 billion now. So back in the 70s, there were engineers from GE who knew that they were putting up these this nuclear facility that was not going to be safe, and they actually resigned over it. So it seems that, you know, you look at conspiracy theories and so on and so forth, that we knew this, you know, this was set in place. And who was it set in place by, and what's going to happen? And I would like to say it, I have no fear personally, and I have a family, but I believe in other things. So we can't go into fear, because I think that feeds the negativity by having fear over these things. It's a matter of being aware and dealing with it as best we can.
We all have to be realistic and not afraid to face facts.
This question is for Stanton Freeman and any of the rest of you who may very well have some answers to this issue. But in the era of the International Space Station and all the commercial satellites we have up in the atmosphere, have any of you investigated any evidence of the UFOs which are supplied by the satellites or the International Space Station?
Do I know anything about UFOs being supplied by the International Space Station?
No, being any evidence of the existence, not supplied by the International, but have there been evidence of UFOs that's been reported by the International Space Station? And we have many, many commercial satellites from this country and other countries, and do we have access to information from them?
Well, simple answer is no, I don't know of any. I think there is a great concern with the governments not putting out any more data than they have to about what gets seen anywhere, partly not to release information about the observers, the observatory, if you will, the people who are up there looking. The astronauts have been, I know a couple of astronauts, and they were, how shall I put this, very cautious in how they answered questions about UFO sightings, in such a way that I felt that national security was being involved. They were answering the way people who can't release information because it's classified would answer. I've had a couple of cases like that. So I don't know where the beginning and ending is of the prevention of astronauts from speaking about UFOs. Some have talked. I mean, I've met a couple of astronauts, but there's something going on, and there are restraints. I'll guarantee you that.
Yeah, that is a good question, and it just so happens that I got an email from Sedona MUFON, and they have a speaker, an individual who was actually involved in the creation of a satellite that was being used to track things flying through the atmosphere, you know, the very question you're asking about. He is going back, and at quite an early point in time, his work on this satellite, that the data was acquired that he calls absolute proof of the existence of UFOs that came from data that came from that satellite. And this is being done, talked about by this person at Sedona MUFON next week.
This question is for anyone. In your research, have you come across anything that has caused you to have certain perspectives in either direction in the areas of climate change or artificial intelligence?
Well, on climate change, there's no question we're in a planet in which the temperature is going up all the time. And even in spite of our president saying that it's fake news, it's not. And it's probably going to have consequences that are going to be increasingly damaging. And here's another, you're not hearing about this because this administration doesn't want people to talk about it. But I've gotten communications from people who work, for example, inside of the government in Miami. And a year ago, they told me when there is a full moon, we're getting water into plazas. The storm surges are worse. Well, just recently, it was, I believe it was the New York Times or one of the mainstream, did a huge article with photographs showing how much of southern Florida now is truly going underwater, and lots of water. And now, finally, the mayor in Miami, who a year ago had told his inside staff, you do not talk about sea level rise. You do not talk about the fact that we're getting water in the plazas at a full moon. You do not. And that's why people were communicating to say, we got another 1984 situation where a government is saying, you do not talk about the truth. Well, now it's so bad that there are millions, billions of dollars that are now being talked about. What are they going to do? Are they going to start putting dikes? Some of the cities that have more money in Florida right now, Google this. What is happening in southern Florida trying to deal with already existing water surges? It is another example in every direction that governments will lie and deceive and manipulate and pass laws when it is not in their interest to tell the public the truth. From my point of view, everybody should be dealing with the consequences of what is going to happen when a good portion of Florida is faced with being underwater and there's no way dikes are going to protect it. That is kind of at the essence of everything we're facing. Governments lie, and humans you've got to find out facts for yourself and make decisions on how you want to survive in a planet that is changing rapidly.
Hi, my question is to Linda regarding the trumpet sounds and the loud booms that's heard around the world. I've been reading a lot about that, and I don't know if it's increasing in frequency or I know if it's tied to the Earth's core, the pole shifts, and the government's not saying anything. It's really strange that all these people are coming up with this, and, there's no investigation at all. And are they just gonna leave it to, go off planet and leave us here to deal with it, the rich and powerful,
For people who follow Earth Files, I think I've done 165 reports. I think I saw that the other day. I've done 165 reports since January of 2011. This has a beginning. And the interesting thing is, it goes away. There's cycles. There is cycles in time. I almost now expect that I'm going to hear from Fort Knox or certain areas or Salem in Massachusetts at certain times of the year. And there are, let's put it this way, there's data now from people who are studying the core of the Earth that there might be indications that in this century we might have a magnetic pole shift. How many people, please, I would really like a show of hands, how many people think when there is a pole shift that the Earth flips over? Well, let me suggest that from physicists studying this is one of their pet peeves. They want people to know that at least based on hundreds of magnetic pole shifts, it is a change of positive and negative, but the Earth itself is not rolling over. I know the hypothesis about the crust possibly changing. Everyone that I'm interviewing that is studying this, they say, no, the public needs to understand it's going to be as it has been hundreds of times in the past. The North Pole and the South Pole will just exchange magnetic charges. Here's the problem. The last time this happened was about 865 million years ago. And they have thought, no, it's 865,000 years ago. And they have thought that this would happen every 250,000, but when they go back and look at clays and sediments in a lake in Italy that is just a beautiful rendition of the Earth's history, and they look at places in mountains that have clay, they will determine that there have been periods where the magnetic poles changed maybe every 200,000 years for maybe half a million years. Then we're in a big stretch. It's gone on for a very long time. What they don't know is, based on one of the last records, the magnetic field went down to near zero, and then popped back up, and then went down to near zero, and did this over and over for about 100 years. Well, if the magnetic field of the Earth goes to zero, depending upon how long it stays, we have no protection from solar energy. We have, they've already calculated if this magnetic field change occurs like the last one, and they put computer models are working on this, the number of skin cancer cases goes up something like 250,000 a year. So that means populations are going to have to be educated about if they start getting down toward zero, something that would be pretty dramatic, you'd hear about that everywhere, then we might actually be in the century where finally there will be this magnetic field shift. What they don't know is what will happen to birds and what is the relationship between the core of the Earth, the big iron crystal core surrounded by a sea of liquid iron, and that's the motor, one turning one way and the ocean going the other. There are hypotheses that if there is a magnetic field change and you get the change at the iron atom level inside this core, it might end up creating infrasound that comes through the mantle out to this rind that we live on that's about 15 to 20 miles around all of this other internal iron. And infrasound, they've studied this can happen. Infrasound can come out of the surface of the Earth, go up and hit the ionosphere, and come back as audible sound. Some of this might be related to changes in the core, but some of it might also have to do, quite literally, with some kind of Earth secret war going on in some sort of a bizarre military way between us and some type of non-human alien presence. And I'm not trying to describe a sci-fi film. It's been suggested to me by some people without proof in the military that something like that is going on. So we could be in a combination. It could be natural, and it could be something going on that is causing these strange booms in cycles in places on this planet, but it is still going on now. So 2011 to 2017, will we get an answer? I don't know. Maybe we will see the skies fill with craft before we have the answer. I don't know.
We're at about 5 minutes left. We do need to stay on time. We have one thing that we want to do right after the panel, and then we'll let the speakers take off so we can get set up to give away the drawing. So I think we really probably only have time for one more question. Sorry. We can see how this goes.
I was wondering if genetically, if there was any kind of link to abductees, if there's any kind of genetic link that we can follow scientifically.
There's been a great deal of speculation about various links that people of certain lineage, connected to, you name it, Native American, whatever, that there's a genetic connection, a lineage where it's followed in families, that there's a connection to certain blood types, but I don't know if any of this stuff has really been scientifically verified on a wide scale. There's a lot of DNA stuff going on right now because the technology exists where we can just take a sample and send it into various entities, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, National Geographic has one. You can have your DNA analyzed and compared to a database that's really getting very, very large. And this is be a very interesting line of inquiry that it's wide open. I mean, the potential right there is for some discovery because it's a question that hasn't been looked at.
I know when I was working with Bud in the mid to late 80s, and I was having that period of time in my life where things were coming in at me like crazy and I had to write them down. One of the things that I wrote down and Bud had was that a lot of the answers that we're looking for we can find in our own bodies, in our own blood. And, I didn't know what it meant. I just wrote it down and I told him, but that was something that was coming to me in that mess of stuff that was coming at me, and I had to stop and draw it or write it down or something. And I still feel that really strongly, that I'm not talking about blood type, I'm talking about DNA. I think there are a lot of answers in there, and I really hope that sometime somebody takes some time and effort and looks more deeply into that.
I might be remembering this wrong, but wasn't some of the stuff you got had to do with looking the T cells for specific information that would show patterns for who was being abducted? Was that you or another one of our crazy friends?
That might have been Gene.
Okay.
Put us all together. But genetically, or, family-wise, I mean, my mother had experiences, I had experiences, my sons had experiences, and my granddaughter has recently been talking about somebody trying to pull her through the window. And we don't talk about this around her. We don't allow her to watch TV because we don't want to scare her, and we also didn't want to have this come up and, you know, not understand whether it was something she saw on TV or something she'd overheard. We didn't want to contaminate her thought processes like that in case something came up, and something did come up. So there's 4 generations right there. I don't know how far back it goes, but I can tell you that much, so.
Genetic lineage is a question that both MUFON and FREE have asked on their questionnaires to identify commonalities among experiencers. And the majority of experiencers have stated that it appears to be generational in their families.
Maybe just one short comment to bring Dolores Cannon into the thing, that there may be a spiritual overlay of this as well, that you have the 3 groups of volunteers that have come, and that it may be genetic, but before that, people choose to have those type of genes.
One follow-up question on the kind of the noises, the kind of the trumpet sounds. You mentioned some kind of I think Linda, you mentioned there was like a variation over a time variation or a cycle or something like that. Can you say a little more about that? Is there an annual cycle, or is there some other periodicity to it or something like that? Regional or any patterns, things like that?
For example, Fort Knox, Kentucky, in the month of June to July, I believe every year since 2011, has had a spate of people who they will call and say, it sounded and felt like a car ran into my house. And that gives you a sense that they're getting vibration. It's a big loud noise. The floor shakes. Every once in a while, windows crack. There was a police officer in Georgia. To give you an idea, it swings 2 ways. The booms can be down to 1 house and 1 family on a block of 10 houses, and 9 houses, no one hears anything. Only 1 house. This has happened many times, very peculiar. And there is a retired Navy captain in Florida. He had this happen in his house, and he called me. He had heard me on Coast doing interviews about this. He called and he said, I want you to know, 23 years I've worked in the Navy, and I have just had this phenomena. And he said, I want you to know that it hit 1 wall of my house. 1 wall, and I'm aware, and it felt like a compression wave from above. Okay, if you go to Wisconsin about 4 years ago, that was the mayor that made national television. I did an interview with her, and she was out with her city manager that night after these explosive booms that were being reported by hundreds and hundreds of people. And she is walking with her city manager. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and she said there was a huge boom. They all heard it, but she felt the bottoms of her feet were slapped. She said it hurt. And so that's from below. So there are all kinds of reports from very credible people who they think it's coming from below. There's somebody like the Navy captain who said it was without question, it was a compression wave from above and it only was on 1 wall. Now, one place, Salem, and that area in Massachusetts coming down into Rhode Island, almost every October, there have been a series of reports from almost the same, like within 10 square miles. And in one of those, there was a security camera on a house. I think that the time on that one was something like 12, 11 after midnight or something, like late at night, so it's dark out. And that video is very dramatic because you see it went absolutely, the whole frame almost whites out. It had just been looking like a normal dark neighborhood. And you hear, it's very fast, and some people compare it to cannons without any explanation. Well, I went so far as I contacted the Weather Service. I wanted to find out if at that time, at that moment, in that town, was there anything, heat lightning, thunderstorm? Was there anything that could explain this? And it was clear, it was dry, there were no storms for hundreds of miles. So whatever happened, that was one case where a security camera got the flash of light in this boom. Now the trumpets, they really do. When you study and listen and you hear, it's just exactly like what happened with UFOs. Somebody's throwing up a pie pan. And you'll hear, oh no, it's these teenagers and they're playing with music. They've got a sound and they're distributing it to the world, and there is no such thing. I beg to differ. I have now heard, I have no idea. Seems like 300, 400, 500 different iPhones, various things that come to me. Well, I think a man who was delivering newspapers in Memphis, Tennessee, and I think this was the next spring, I think this one was 2012, in May, and he was the most down-to-earth guy. Every morning at 3 a.m., he would be picking up his newspapers to deliver in Memphis. And he said, the sound was so eerie that I literally stopped. I couldn't move. And he said, the first thing that came into my head was, it sounds like an eerie trumpet. And then he thought of the Gabriel blowing his horn from the Bible. Well, then you do research and you find out there is not one mention of an angel Gabriel blowing a horn in the Christian Bible. But it talks in the apocalyptic literature about the 7 angels, of which the angels themselves are the ones, and they're unnamed, and they're blowing horns. A lot of people come to this association with this very eerie sound that they hear. From an investigative reporter point of view, when you get over 2011 to 2017, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports, not just coming from the Northern Hemisphere. This is New Zealand, Australia, it's all over the world. And you realize there is some kind of a cycle that is happening in certain geographic areas. I don't have the answer, but something clearly weird, because it keeps happening. And it's 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So we're starting into the 7th year of this phenomena. And how many of you have seen the UK big headlines? This was 2 years ago, when at the same moment on the planet, if it was New York, Rochester, the Great Lakes area, there was a huge boom. Thousands of people, police. At the same moment, meaning we're 6 or 7, depending on the time, hours between London and New York. This was an event of booms being reported in England at what would be exactly the same moment as what happened in Rochester and the Great Lakes. Was it the same phenomenon? None of us know. But that's a huge region, and the police officer, I'll end on this, the police officer that I talked to, this was in 2012, 5 counties in the state of Georgia at approximately noon, all 911, fire, police, emergency, there were thousands of calls. Everybody saying, what was the big boom? What just exploded? Did somebody drop a bomb? And there was a police officer, he was driving home for lunch. He comes up, he hears this horrible boom, and he parks his car, and he doesn't even go into the garage and gets out. He doesn't know what's coming. And then he said he realized that whatever made this huge boom that then he learns is affecting 5 counties at the same moment, the garage door jumped out of its track, and the cement where that door jumped out cracked. And he knew that everything was fine when he left. That boom had that power to make a garage door jump out of its track and crack the cement. And that's 5 counties, down to one house, to the Great Lakes and England, all at the same time. This gives you just a tiny feeling of how bizarre this has been for the last 7 years and counting. And anybody who lives someplace and they know that social media and the local TV and police, fire, 911, if you know that there's something widespread, please get in touch with me. And here's one last thing to remember. Homeland Security has never said one word in 7 years about booms that have been reported and investigated by police at city, state, and county levels over these 7 years. If that isn't guilt, I don't know what it is.
All right, thank you very much again to all of you for sharing your hard work and your talents with us. We have one thing to do. Who's my one thing celebrity that's coming up? Here we go. You guys hang tight for just a second. We're always doing one more thing, you know. Hey.
Hello, everyone. I need to read this, and I will explain why, because I am, this person is not only a personal hero, but a personal mentor, and they mean so much that I know I'm going to cry, so I'm going to read it, and also don't want to miss anything. Every year, KGRA Radio does an award. And presenting the 2017 KGRA Lifetime Achievement Award is not only an honor, but it's a privilege. It's also a very humbling experience because of the heart behind the award, but it's also because of the overwhelming success of the recipient. This year's honoree is truly one of our most admired and most respected presence in the field today. From the early days before it was cool, before the internet, and before UFO reality TV shows, we have a very few that have not only paved the way and blazed our trails, but are 100% responsible for the high standards and the courage to demand the truth. She has set the bar very high, and she has literally carried a football down the field. This has not been without the opposition throwing hits and trying to take her out. One person has led in all efforts and sincerely for an entire lifetime with very little apprehension or vacation. A lifetime award should represent exactly that, a lifetime of successful contributions and achievement. Our recipient is brave, tenacious, an example of excellence, an example of how to do this. She is beautiful inside and out. She's extremely successful and modest. She's an investigative reporter. She is an author, a journalist with the biggest media presence. There's a special title out here for some of us. It's called Women of Ufology. Although we appreciate this very special title, I'd place every penny I own, every penny I have, on this honoree in any field with any UFO investigator. My money is also confident that she will not only hold her own, but there is no doubt that by the end, she will have raised the bar and taught many a few more skills. She is a rule maker, and her contributions bring an enormous amount of credit to herself and to our field of ufologies. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present the 2017 KGRA Radio Lifetime Achievement Award, Ms. Linda Moulton Howe.
Linda Howe, everyone.
Thank you so much. And you know something, the feeling of loving each other in a sort of strange way, of people who are trying to understand something that governments say doesn't exist. If we could carry that feeling that we have from this room out into this world, it's not a phony Valentine card, I mean it. I love you, I love these people, I love this effort, and I just truly thank you, KGRA, not only for this unexpected award, but for being a voice on this planet that is trying to tell the truth. Thank you, and Chase, I love you.